the mic, but I'm also pretty loud. Really good to see y'all. Greg, Sahlem. I'm so grateful to be here and a part of this. And this has just been a great community, and I definitely want to say thanks to Ahmed and Colleen especially for organizing it, so thanks. So I was originally supposed to talk about the things I learned from running a trial, but really I renamed it to the many things I learned from running a trial. And in real time, I'm actually changing my title to some of the many things I learned during the trial. I could definitely write a book about this. To be really clear, I do not want to write a book, but I could. Anyway, so just some quick disclosures. I'm not going to spend more than a second on this. So I collaborated a little bit with McVenture and MECTA and NIH and some other funders, including William Leap, has supported our work. And then most importantly, I know sometimes you can talk to people who are trying to convince you of stuff, and I very much like to espouse an ideal lab mentality. So if there's something I have wrong, please tell me. I will thank you, I promise. Acknowledging just tons and tons of people. With time, I'm going to spend more time on this, but obviously everyone knows it takes an army. But basically, this is what I want to talk about. I want to just run through 3 trials we've run so far, and I'll talk a little bit about a 4th that we've just finished, actually. This is all in cannabis use disorder, and they're all iterative, which is why I think it's important to talk about them in a series as opposed to as a singular study, the most recent phase 2 one, which is, I think, how I specifically invited about this. And then there are 4 main take-home lessons I want to talk about because I think they're all very actionable, and I think that's really important. There's a lot of other lessons learned and some other things that I think are important and interesting, but I won't get into all that. So really quickly, I'll take only just a minute to talk about this, which was the first trial we did, which was just a single session, active versus sham, just to see if we could get the coil on people's head and whether or not there was a hint of craving. And the answer is yes, we could. It was feasible. And there were some take-homes from there that I won't go into just in the interest of spending time in the kind of meat of this. So the next thing, so once we were able to do that, right away, always along, we said, well, we want this to be a treatment. There's no treatments for cannabis use disorder, as you all know. Nothing is established, certainly not FDA cleared or approved. And so we started off with a small pilot trial. And this was one actually as we were waiting a funding decision of our larger trial. And we had a long discussion, can we just start our larger trial in hopes that we get funded? We had some resources to do it, but do we do a small pilot trial? And we landed on the small pilot trial, and boy, was that lucky. And also smart by mentors, so I'll just say not total luck. But basically what we did is we took 10 folks with cannabis use disorder. We gave them 2 sessions of TMS, all open label, per day for 2 weeks. So a total of 20 sessions over 10 days. And then we just followed people for 4 weeks. We did MRI before and after. But here's what we found. This is the paradigm: a session of TMS, 30-minute break, session of TMS, 10 hertz. All the details of that I'm happy to get into, but it's also in these papers. But here's the first thing that we found, is that we could not do that. That was infeasible. Out of 10 people, we retained 3. So I mean 7 out of 10 people dropped out. And we spoke to them, and thankfully we came up with a pretty reasonable answer, which was, hey, I have a job. I can't come in every day for 2 weeks, for 2 hours. That's just not going to happen. And so that was a really, really important thing. The 3 people who did finish actually did really well clinically. I won't get into that. That was the first take home, because feasibility rules. Right? If you can't do something, you're not going to ever do it clinically anyway, so it's just basically useful or useless. And then the other thing was that paradigms aren't written in stone. When we were doing all of this, it was very much the paradigm that you do daily sessions of RTMS. But already there were a couple of studies showing that you didn't have to do daily. There was some unpublished work showing that 3 times a week was just as good, which has now since been published. And then clinically, we would do these double sessions twice a week. That mixed with my primary mentor on this study, who had done lots of clinical trials. Oops, sorry, that was actually your 15 minutes. I just ended up. So I'm 5 minutes in, everybody. But she had very consistently done her cannabis trials with 2 visits per week. And she said, yep, I can do that, no sweat. And so basically we merged those things and said, who knows if 5 days a week is important, or 3 days, who really knows? So let's do 2. And thankfully this project got funded. This was a K23, thank you, Ida. Very, very grateful for this. And this was a phase 2 trial where we randomized people to two visits per week for 5 weeks, 2 sessions per visit. So total of 20 sessions distributed over 5 weeks. And this was active and versus a very good sham, e-sham, which held up very well. And the first thing that I can tell you is the feasibility worked. We actually had a 70% retention rate, which to date still is the best published retention rate. I'm not bragging, just saying that you can change these things. You come up with a problem, you can be creative and say, how do I address that problem? And we did, and that actually worked very well. So we had a very good retention rate. So the next thing, which was really interesting, is we initially had a primary outcome with phase 2 trial, 36 people per cell, 72 of craving, and we had initially chosen our primary outcome as cue-induced craving. Then along the way, we were like, oh, is that really the most important thing? It's probably static craving, and static craving is probably more reliable and do it clinically a little bit better. And so we changed our primary outcome. And the first data I looked at obviously made me very upset in that our primary outcome, which was static craving using the marijuana craving questionnaire, showed no difference. And in fact, the sham group actually did a touch better, which was really not very, I was not very happy to hear that. But we actually looked at our other primary outcome, and look at this, isn't this interesting? Dovetailing off of Claudia's talk, craving. Craving is not a monolith, actually. And so static craving was not the right direction. And there's some confounds which I guess I will have to just talk about. But when we looked at our initial primary outcome, which was cue-induced craving, there was a positive effect in the right direction. It was durable out for 4 weeks. So pretty interesting. I hadn't initially planned on talking about this, but since we have an extra couple of minutes, there were a lot of things that initially we hadn't taken account for. And one of those was the fact that in our active group we had some clinical efficacy. And so people reduced their use, and several of them quit. And so we actually had everyone on level footing with this static craving, this spontaneous craving measure. And what we found out is that one of the things that was definitely different was time since last use. And so in the active group, there was more time since the last cannabis use. And that was a confounder. It didn't end up being statistical in our model, so that's not our paper or anything. But that's a confound we definitely identified, and we were able to at least get a little hint of it. So that's the next thing, is measurement matters. And this is basically take-homes from both this phase 2 and then the small pilot we did, is that you should definitely do phase 2 trials. If you're about to do something big, you should definitely try and at least get a few folks and make sure that your paradigm is reasonable and works well. This was our clinical efficacy outcome, and this was phase 2, again, not a huge sample, but we did have a signal both with abstinence and also days per week of cannabis use in the active group relative to the sham. But this is something that became really interesting, and this is in our papers. The trial happened actually over 2 sequential sites, so it was a multi-site, but not in the conventional means. I moved, actually, so I started off in Charleston, South Carolina, then I moved to California. And although this was our average efficacy, we found a differential efficacy. So most of our abstinence data was driven in our California sample, and then the days per week of use actually was in both sites, so we found a reduction in days per week of use both places. But what I can tell you, and I really didn't appreciate this when I was in South Carolina, is, oh boy, are there differences in severity. And there's a reason why the cliche California sober exists. Because people in California, many of them really like marijuana, and there is definitely a lot more severity in California with legality and all that high potency marijuana that's just less available in South Carolina. And so we really looked at that, and we said, well, that's good to know. So does this mean that TMS only works in California? And we said, probably not. And I doubt there's a Stanford effect, although Stanford is a magical place. I will agree with everybody. But basically, we want to look more deeply about that and say, well, how can we actually get at this severity? And the first thing that, an observation, and I hope nobody's too sensitive about this, but the first thing that I think is most of us can agree with is the DSM criteria are actually not that precise. They're very imprecise, in fact. They're binary, and you can have a huge amount of variance in pathology in the DSM criteria. And so that's the first thing, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. So first of all, that was actually not particularly useful, the DSM criteria, because we looked at that. Does that tell us what the severity is? The answer is no. The other thing we looked at was kind of what I would call is end organ damage of substance use disorders, which was problems related to substance use. Thankfully, there's a validated scale, the marijuana problem scale. We did get that actually as part of our counseling intervention, and that actually moderated our abstinence effect. And it also related with our effective days per week of use, although that wasn't a significant moderator. So the severity of cannabis use disorder definitely mattered. And I can tell you, just seeing these folks, the people who were all-day, everyday smokers who were trying to quit definitely had an opportunity for more efficacy. And that's basically what our data looked like. In terms of the other thing, severity, which I wasn't sure I was going to get to talk about, so I don't have a slide on this. But for our most recent trial, we did another small pilot trial before doing some more sophisticated stuff. We're doing some functional neuroimaging, targeting, and that sort of thing. But one of the things I said is, hey, there's got to be some way to measure the severity more systematically. And so what we did as a group, we put all our heads together, and we took the DSM criteria, and we actually just put them, each criteria on a 6-point spread, just like the moderates, and we built a structured interview. Just on the first iteration of that, and there's definitely some editing, that has been really interesting. And I've been able to actually look at some of that severity just by doing the DSM criteria. For any of you who have cross research with depression, it wasn't fancy, it's just the moderates. So in case you're wondering why 6 points, it's because the moderates done 6 points, and that works real well in depression. So we did that. That's another way that we've been able to kind of look at it. So these are the things we found in our trial. So first of all, the good, we found an effect. Huzzah, that's really, really great. In cannabis use disorder, there are very few trials that actually show a beneficial effect. And believe it or not, that effect that you saw, which is just a moderate effect, was as big as any other trial, including pharmaceutical trials. And our retention rate was really good with this edited protocol. The bad, well, it's a clinician, and a clinician at heart. Obviously, I want everyone to get better. I don't want just a few people to get better. I don't want a moderate effect size. I want something that's going to really get people moving. And our effect was moderate. I'll just own that, And the other thing that we didn't really do is measurably, really very well measure behavioral syndrome, right? So there's no DSM criteria going back to that of uses cannabis 7 days a week, right? It's behavioral syndrome, so we didn't measure that well. And so in some of our pilot work that we just finished, we did measure quality of life and also that DSM scale that I was just mentioning. And then the next thing are the unknowns. Is there a way to make our effect size a larger one? Can we measure that behavioral syndrome? And then can we increase the precision of our treatment paradigm? And then is there a biomarker? We have a candidate one we're looking at. And so basically, those were kind of the things we addressed. So in terms of making the moderate effect size larger, this is kind of the next one, is you can both innovate and move forward. There are a couple of really low-hanging fruit things. Is anyone taking my time, by the way? If I'm running long, we'll do the boredom test. So whoever's bored, as soon as someone's bored, put your arm up and I'll stop. What's that? 12 minutes. Oh, perfect. 3 minutes. I got it. That's great. So basically, we said there's some low-hanging fruit. So certainly there's a dose-response curve with DMS. I think everybody will agree to that. There's abundant data in depression, and then now a couple of trials in addiction looking at Chris Shepard's work in Roosevelt Park, looking at that dose-response for smoking cessation. And so we definitely can increase the number of sessions. When we initially started, we had 30 minutes in between because I was so worried about feasibility. But probably Nolan's work at Stanford with the accelerated TMS and having that extended to 15 minutes, that's pretty low hanging fruit. And so we think that there's plenty there. And so already just with the idea that we can increase the dose and then increase that intersession interval and then improve our measurement, we think that's probably enough to get us into a very clinically relevant place. And so this is a trial that we're hoping to do. This was a well-reviewed protocol for NIDA-CTN. We're waiting a funding decision on this one, but we hope to do this. But in the meanwhile, we've piloted out some of those things that I talked about with some more sessions. We absolutely were able to deliver those. We still had a very good retention rate. The increased intervals, so slightly longer visits, that was no problem. We were able to measure things in that DSM. So kind of the clinical things we were absolutely able to do. And so in our hope, if in a perfect world, what will happen is we'll get the CTN trial, these small innovations, the increased dose and such will give us a medium plus effect size, hopefully large effect size, maybe, we'll see. And we'll be able to get that out. And this paradigm is very easy. It's just BMF3, hertz. Every TMS clinic can do it. In the meanwhile, while we're doing this, we've also been working with some much more sophisticated paradigm. We adapted an MRI task to do precision targeting. We're looking actually both at PLPSC and BMPSC, and I know everyone's like, yeah, of course, that's what we're doing, but we're hoping to be able to test out a biomarker, and the biomarker we're looking at actually is striatal reactivity. Are people more ventral or more dorsal striatal reactive? With the idea that with Colleen's work, which is awesome, that if you tap on the BMPFC, you go to ventral striatum, and if you tap on DLPFC, you go to dorsal striatum. And so we're doing both of those things simultaneously. We're going to try and get into the clinic, and then if we get this CTN trial done and it's positive, and we get out in the clinic, and then we can get our more sophisticated paradigm going, the idea is to layer on that. So those are the things that I think are important. And I always say this, so I'll slide I end with, the sky's the limit, but it's still early, so we still need to kind of work on some stuff. So thanks, everybody.